Welcome back, everyone. This is the second last part of the chapter Open Economy Macroeconomics Basic Concepts. The book is Brief Principles of Microeconomics, 5th edition by N. Gregory Menke. In this part, we will discuss the factors that affect imports and exports in a country. In this part, we will study factors affecting imports and exports, as well as factors affecting net capital outflow. But first, let's discuss factors affecting imports and exports. So, we will be studying the factors which increase or decrease imports and exports. So, for example, if in United States, if their exports increase, why would they increase? And if the imports increase, what are the reasons behind that? So, we will be studying those reasons, those factors. The first is the tastes of consumers for domestic and foreign goods. So, this is the first factor. If consumers prefer foreign goods, then the demand of imported goods will rise. If consumers prefer domestic goods, then the demand of imported goods will fall. So, here we are talking about the tastes of consumers. So, if the consumers in United States, they prefer goods from, for example, Malaysia, for instance, Malaysian palm oil, if they prefer that oil, then the demand for the Malaysian palm oil will increase and the imports in United States will increase. However, if the consumers prefer domestic goods like in the case of United States, we have a classic example of iPhones. Many people in United States purchase iPhones, right? So, in that case, the demand of Chinese cell phones will decrease if consumers prefer the cell phones produced in United States. So if the consumers prefer domestic goods, then the demand of imported goods will fall because the consumers don't really need those, right? So, it depends on the tastes of consumers. If consumers prefer international goods, foreign goods, then the imports will increase. If they prefer domestic goods, then the imports will decrease. And similarly, in foreign countries, if those consumers prefer American goods, then their imports will increase and United States exports will increase. And if they prefer their own goods, then their imports would reduce and the exports of United States and some other countries around the world would decrease. So, it all depends on the taste of consumers. That's the first factor. The second factor is the prices of goods at home and abroad. Here we are talking about inflation. If the prices increase in the domestic market, then what will happen? That's what we'll try to understand. So first, let's read the definition. If inflation is running rampant in a country, the price to produce a unit of a product may be higher than the price in a lower inflation country. This would impact exports, thus affecting the trade balance. Let's divide this into several parts. First, if inflation is running rampant in a country, this means that if there is very high inflation rate in a country, the price to produce a unit of a product may be higher than the price in a lower inflation country. So, this part means that, for example, if there are two countries, let's say India and Pakistan, India versus Pakistan, and they both are cotton producers. If the price of cotton increases in Pakistan, then what will happen? If the price of cotton increases in Pakistan, then India's cotton will be cheaper for international consumers, right? Because the price of cotton in Pakistan is increased, so it has become less competitive as compared to India. Therefore, the demand for Pakistan's cotton in the international market will reduce, and the demand for India's cotton will increase, or some other country's cotton. So that's the second part. The third part is this would impact exports, thus affecting the trade balance. Therefore, in the case of Pakistan, the exports would reduce because the cotton is expensive now, exports in the case of cotton, and this will mean negative trade balance, or the positive trade balance would reduce. So that's the second part, prices of goods at home and abroad. If there is inflation, then the products and goods and services in domestic market, they are more expensive for foreign consumers, and they will shift their demand to other cheaper sources, like to other countries. So that's the second factor. The first was tastes, the second was prices or inflation rate. Let's move on to the third one. So the third factor is the exchange rates at which people can use domestic currency to buy foreign currencies. The third factor is exchange rate. What is the exchange rate? It will also have an impact on imports and exports. A domestic currency that has appreciated significantly raises the cost of exported goods and can leave exporters priced out of global markets. So here we are talking about appreciation of exchange rate. So we have like appreciation as well as depreciation of exchange rate, right? So we will discuss both cases. In the case of appreciation, imports will be cheaper. They will become cheaper in the case of appreciation when your currency's value improves, and exports will be more expensive for foreigners. So what will happen in the case of appreciation? When imports become cheaper, imports will increase, and when exports they become expensive, exports will decrease. So that's what happens in the case of appreciation. In the case of depreciation, the opposite happens, because in the case of depreciation, exports become cheaper and imports become expensive. So when exports become cheap, the exports will increase, and when imports become expensive, people in domestic market will reduce their consumption of imported goods, and the imports would reduce. The fourth factor is the incomes of consumers at home and abroad. Here we are talking about the incomes of consumers. So either the income of consumers will increase or decrease in the domestic market or in the foreign country. So in one of the cases, an increase in income of foreign consumers would increase demand of domestic goods. So for examples, if consumers in United States become richer, they will increase demand of foreign goods. So the imports in United States would increase, and for other countries their exports will increase. So the other countries' exports would increase, assuming everything else constant. Therefore, if the consumers in United States they are becoming richer, then they might increase the demand of Chinese products. Therefore, the exports in China will increase, and the imports for United States would increase. In the second case, an increase in income of domestic consumers would increase demand of imported goods and services. So here, it's the same case, but it's been phrased differently. If the income of consumers in United States, if they are considered as domestic consumers, if their income increases, then they will increase the demand for imported goods and services. So they will increase their demand for Chinese goods and services. So these two are different ways of thinking. In this case, we are thinking about being from the perspective of American consumer. In this case, we are talking from the perspective of Chinese export market. So if you're sitting in China and Americans become rich, they might increase the demand of your product. So incomes very important as well. That's the fourth factor. The fifth factor is the cost of transporting goods from country to country. If the cost of transporting goods increases, then the international trade would reduce. If the cost of transporting goods decreases, then it will help international trade. There will be more trade. So transport costs have significant impacts on the structure of economic activities as well as on international trade. That is kind of obvious because a major portion of the goods and services throughout the world, they are moved through the different ships. That's the main one, and then there are also intercountry trains as well as aeroplanes, and there are also land transportation using trucks and stuff like that. But the most cheaper one is through sea, and if the more cheaper the transportation becomes, the higher the trade would be. So there is also empirical evidence of this, because empirical evidence, it underlines that raising transportation costs by 10% reduces trade volumes by more than 20%. So that's empirical evidence, that's the real world evidence as well. So that's the fifth factor. If the transportation costs reduce, then it will increase the volume of trade throughout the world, and that will directly affect imports and exports of different countries throughout the world. And finally, the sixth factor is government policies toward international trade. How could we forget the government, the one of the most important factor? So if government encourages exports, if the government decides that, okay, we need to increase exports, they might change their policies, and they might give export bonus, which is a kind of a bonus to exporters. They might reduce duties on exporters. In that case, exports would increase. And if the government wants to discourage imports, what they might do is they might levy import duty. So in that case, imports will become more expensive. So the government is kind of discouraging imports in that case. So because once import duty is levied, imports will be expensive. Domestic consumers would prefer domestic goods then. So that is the sixth factor. These six factors are really important, and as these variables change, so does the amount of international trade. That's it for the factors that affect imports and exports.